Smoke rose from the sea in pillars, dark against the gray April sky. From the bridge of the USS Yorktown, pilots returning from their strikes spoke in hushed tones about what they had witnessed. 250 miles to the northwest, the largest battleship ever built was dying, her 18-inch guns silent, her decks ablaze. The Japanese had called her Yamato, a name that carried the soul of their empire. For years, she had been hidden from the world, a secret weapon wrapped in steel thicker than any fortress wall. The Imperial Navy believed her unsinkable, a floating castle designed to face multiple enemy battleships at once and emerge victorious. Yet on this day, the 7th of April, 1945, she lay broken beneath waves of American aircraft, her massive hull torn open not by shells but by bombs and torpedoes delivered from the sky. The irony was brutal and complete. Japan had built the mightiest battleship in history just as battleships themselves became obsolete. The story of the Yamato-class is not one of triumph but of tragic miscalculation. It begins in the mid-1930s, when Japanese naval planners faced a problem that seemed impossible to solve. The Washington Naval Treaty had collapsed, and war with the United States loomed inevitable. Japan's industrial capacity could never match American shipyards. While the United States could flood the Pacific with dozens of battleships and carriers, Japan would struggle to field a fraction of that number. The solution, Japanese strategists decided, lay not in quantity but in overwhelming quality. They would build a battleship so powerful, so heavily armored, and so destructively armed that it could engage multiple American warships simultaneously and win. The result would be a vessel designed around a single devastating weapon, the largest naval guns ever mounted on a ship. Planning began in earnest in 1934, shortly after Japan withdrew from the League of Nations and renounced its treaty obligations. The Naval General Staff convened conferences where engineers submitted design after design. 24 separate proposals were considered before Captain Kikyu Fujimoto's final plan, designated a -140 F6, was accepted in March 1937. The specifications defied belief. The ship would displace 72,800 tons fully loaded, nearly 20% larger than the American Iowa-class battleships. Her main armament would consist of 9 46-centimeter guns, officially designated as 40-centimeter weapons to conceal their true size. Each gun barrel measured 69 feet long and weighed over 147 tons. The complete turret assemblies weighed 2,774 tons, more than many destroyers of the era. These guns could hurl 3,200-pound armor-piercing shells over 25 miles with accuracy that bordered on the uncanny. If those shells found their mark, nothing afloat could survive. The armor scheme matched the audacity of the armament. The main belt along the ship's waterline ran 16 inches thick, sloped to deflect incoming fire. The deck armor reached 8 inches in critical areas, designed to resist plunging fire from enemy guns at extreme range. Bulkheads protecting the citadel stretched 14 inches thick. This was protection on a scale never before attempted. American intelligence, when it finally pieced together fragments of information years later, could scarcely believe the reports. Even after Yamato was sunk, Western newspapers continued to underestimate her displacement by nearly 30%. Construction began in absolute secrecy. The dry dock at Kure Naval Arsenal was expanded and partially covered to hide the work from aerial reconnaissance. Thousands of laborists toiled behind canvas screens and camouflage netting. Security was so tight that workers in one section had no idea what those in another were building. The keel was laid on November 4, 1937. For nearly 3 years, the ship took shape in silence. When she was finally launched on August 8, 1940, only a select few Japanese naval officers knew her true specifications. The launch ceremony was deliberately austere, with none of the fanfare that typically accompanied such events. Even then, the Imperial Navy feared foreign spies might glimpse too much. Yamato's sister ship, Musashi, followed a similar path. Laid down at the Mitsubishi yards in Nagasaki in March 1938, she was launched in November 1940 and commissioned in August 1942. A third hull, originally intended as another battleship, was converted mid-construction into the aircraft carrier Shinano after the disaster at Midway revealed Japan's desperate need for carriers. 2 additional Yamato-class hulls were planned but never completed. The Empire's resources, stretched thin by war, could not sustain such ambition. The ships that did reach completion represented the absolute pinnacle of battleship design. Everything about them spoke of power. The hulls were carefully shaped to minimize drag, achieving 58.7% propulsive efficiency at 18 knots, a remarkable figure for vessels of such size. 4 massive steam turbines generated 150,000 shaft horsepower, driving the ships to a top speed of 27 knots. Below decks, the accommodations were surprisingly comfortable. Yamato was the first Japanese warship equipped with air conditioning throughout. Sailors accustomed to the cramped and sweltering conditions of older vessels marveled at the spaciousness. Some derisively called her the Yamato Hotel, a nickname that reflected both admiration and resentment. The ship's secondary armament evolved throughout the war. Initially, she carried 12 6.1-inch guns in 4 triple turrets and 12 5-inch dual-purpose guns. As the threat from aircraft grew, 2 of the 6-inch turrets were removed and replaced with additional anti-aircraft weapons. By 1945, Yamato bristled with 24 5-inch guns and over 160 25mm anti-aircraft guns. It was never enough. The guns themselves became objects of fascination and dread. The Type 94 naval guns fired shells weighing 3,218 pounds for armor-piercing rounds and nearly 3,000 pounds for high-explosive shells. The range exceeded 26 miles. Each gun could fire once every 40 seconds under ideal conditions, though in practice the rate was closer to 1.5 rounds per minute. The recoil was so tremendous that crew members standing within 50 feet of the muzzle risked injury from the blast pressure alone. Measurements taken during trials showed pressures of 100 pounds per square inch at that distance, twice the force generated by the older 16-inch guns on Japan's Nagato-class battleships. When all 9 guns fired in a broadside, the entire ship shuddered. Yet for all this overwhelming firepower, there existed a fatal design flaw that would reveal itself in combat. The armor-piercing shells were so powerful, designed to punch through the thickest battleship armor, that they would pass completely through lightly armored vessels without detonating. This overpenetration would prove catastrophic at the Battle off Samar, where Yamato's shells ripped through American destroyers and escort carriers, inflicting damage but failing to deliver the killing blows that proper detonation would have caused. The Japanese had built a weapon optimized for a kind of warfare that was already slipping into history. Yamato was formally commissioned on December 16, 1941, just 9 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Almost immediately, she became the flagship of the combined fleet under Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. The symbolism was deliberate. Her name, taken from the ancient Yamato province, was often used as a poetic name for Japan itself. To sail aboard Yamato was to carry the soul of the empire. The crew, numbering over 3,000 men, understood the weight of their responsibility. They had been selected from among the Navy's best, trained on the most advanced equipment Japan could produce. They believed their ship was invincible. The Imperial Navy's propaganda carefully cultivated this belief. Yamato was presented not merely as a battleship but as a manifestation of Japanese spiritual and technological superiority. Her existence was proof that the empire could compete with and surpass the industrial might of the West. This narrative became deeply embedded in the national consciousness, even though the ship's specifications remained classified throughout the war. The reality was more complex and far less reassuring. From the moment Yamato entered service, the nature of naval warfare was already transforming. Aircraft carriers, not battleships, had become the decisive weapons of the Pacific. The attack on Pearl Harbor had demonstrated this truth with brutal clarity. At the Battle of Midway, 6 months later, Yamato sailed with the main fleet but remained 300 miles behind Admiral Nagumo's carriers. When Nagumo's strike force was annihilated by American dive bombers, Yamato's guns were too far away to matter. The battleship had been designed for a decisive surface engagement, a climactic gun duel between opposing fleets. That battle would never come. Instead, Yamato spent much of 1942 and 1943 anchored at Truk Atoll or shuffling between bases. She was too valuable to risk, too expensive to fuel, and too slow to keep pace with carrier strike forces. Her crew drilled endlessly, maintaining readiness for a fight that never seemed to arrive. Meanwhile, the war turned steadily against Japan. In December 1943, while transporting troops and supplies, Yamato was struck by a torpedo from the American submarine USS Skate. The hit tore a hole 82 feet wide in her hull, flooding compartments and forcing her return to Kure for repairs. The damage was not critical, but it shattered the illusion of invincibility. If a single submarine could wound the mighty Yamato, what could a concentrated attack achieve? The repairs took weeks. When Yamato finally returned to service in March 1944, her anti-aircraft armament had been significantly upgraded. The threat from American carrier aircraft was now impossible to ignore. In June 1944, Yamato participated in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, serving as an escort for Japanese carriers. The battle became known to American pilots as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese aviation was slaughtered. Yamato's contribution was minimal and embarrassing. At one point, her gunners mistakenly opened fire on returning Japanese aircraft, adding to the chaos and confusion. Then came October 1944 and the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement in history. This would be Yamato's first and only chance to fire her main guns at enemy surface vessels. The moment she had been designed for had finally arrived, yet even here, the reality fell short of the dream. Admiral Tokyo Kurita's center force, which included Yamato and her sister Musashi, was meant to break through to Leyte Gulf and destroy the American amphibious fleet. Musashi was sunk by relentless American air attacks in the Sibuyan Sea before reaching the objective. Yamato pressed on. On the morning of October 25, Kurita's force emerged from the San Bernardino Strait and stumbled upon Taffy 3, a small group of American escort carriers and destroyers. These were not the fleet carriers Kurita expected. They were thin-skinned vessels designed for ground support and anti-submarine warfare, defended by a handful of destroyers and destroyer escorts. The escort carriers could not outrun Yamato. Their aircraft were armed with depth charges and high-explosive bombs suitable for attacking ground targets and submarines, not battleships. By all logic, Taffy 3 should have been annihilated within the hour. At 0700 hours, Yamato's forward turrets opened fire. Colored dye loads in the shells allowed Japanese spotters to track their fall of shot. The range was 35,000 yards, over 17 miles. Shells straddled the escort carrier White Plains. One landed mere feet beneath her keel, the near miss disabling a boiler. Yamato fired salvo after salvo, her massive guns reaching out across the horizon. Yet the American ships refused to die. Destroyers and destroyer escorts, vessels weighing a fraction of Yamato's mass, charged directly toward Kurita's battleships and cruisers. The USS Johnston, commanded by Commander Ernest Evans, raced to within 10,000 yards and launched torpedoes before turning away under a deluge of fire. Yamato's armor-piercing shells, designed to penetrate thick battleship armor, punched straight through Johnston's thin hull without exploding. The destroyer was crippled but continued fighting. The chaos intensified. Smoke screens laid by American destroyers obscured visibility. Aircraft from the escort carriers swarmed overhead, dropping whatever ordnance they carried and making repeated strafing runs even after their ammunition was exhausted. The USS Heermann made a torpedo run that forced Yamato to turn hard to starboard, taking the battleship out of the fight for precious minutes as she maneuvered to avoid the spread. Admiral Kurita, watching from Yamato's bridge, became convinced he was engaging a much larger force. The aggressive American defense, combined with poor visibility and contradictory reports, led him to believe he faced fleet carriers and heavy cruisers. At 0911, believing he had won a great victory but uncertain of the tactical situation, Kurita ordered his ships to withdraw. Yamato turned away from Leyte Gulf. She had fired her guns in anger for the first and only time. She had sunk the escort carrier Gambier Bay and contributed to the loss of several destroyers. But the decisive blow, the climactic surface action for which she had been built, had eluded her once again. The battle off Samar revealed the fundamental obsolescence of the battleship era. Yamato's guns could destroy anything they hit, but in the confusion of modern combat, finding and hitting targets proved nearly impossible. Her armor could withstand shells from any enemy battleship, but battleships were no longer the primary threat. aircraft were. After Lettergulf, Yamato returned to Japan for repairs and further upgrades to her anti-aircraft defenses. By early 1945, the strategic situation had become desperate. American forces had captured Iwo Jima, placing B-29 bombers within easy range of the Japanese home islands. Tokyo burned under waves of incendiary attacks. The invasion of Okinawa began on April 1st, and with it came the crushing realization that the next step would be an assault on the home islands themselves. The Imperial Navy had almost nothing left. Most of its carriers had been sunk. Fuel was critically scarce. The once mighty combined fleet had been reduced to a handful of operational warships huddling in home waters. Among them was Yamato, her crew still believing she was unsinkable, still trusting in the armor that had never been truly tested. Then, in late March 1945, the Emperor himself asked a question that would seal Yamato's fate. Briefed on plans for the defense of Okinawa, Hirohito inquired about the Navy's role. What were they doing to assist in defending the island? That question, posed in the midst of Japan's collapse, demanded an answer. The Navy could not admit it had become irrelevant. Something had to be done, some gesture made to preserve honor and justify the Navy's existence. Thus was born Operation 10-Go, the final sortie, a mission that nearly every officer involved understood to be suicide. The plan was simple in its desperation. Yamato, escorted by the light cruiser Yahaji and 8 destroyers, would sail to Okinawa and attack the American invasion fleet. If she survived long enough to reach the island, she would beach herself and serve as an immobile artillery platform, firing her guns until they were destroyed or ran out of ammunition. Her crew would then go ashore and fight as infantry until they were killed. There was no plan for return. The ships were given only enough fuel for a one-way voyage, though sympathetic officers at the Tokayama fuel depot secretly provided additional oil, perhaps hoping it might somehow make a difference. Vice Admiral Saiki Ito, commander of the force, initially refused to carry out the mission. He called it futile and wasteful. Other officers echoed his protests. Captain Atsushi Oi, an operations officer, shouted in fury when told the operations purpose was to preserve the Navy's honor. Who cares about their glory? He demanded. Damn fools. Yet in the end, duty and the Emperor's implicit command prevailed. Admiral Ito accepted the mission, though his resignation was evident to all who served under him. On April 5, 1945, the crews of the 10 ships were briefed. They were given the opportunity to remain behind. Not one man accepted. Sick and injured sailors were ordered ashore along with 67 naval cadets who had only just arrived. Those who remained knew they were steaming toward death. On the evening of April 5, Yamato's executive officer organized a farewell party. Sake flowed freely. Men drank heavily, laughed, and sang, clinging to camaraderie in the face of oblivion. At 15:20 on April 6, the Surface Special Attack Force departed Tokayama. The weather was overcast, the seas moderate. Yamato's engines thrummed with power as she built speed. Behind her, the destroyers practiced torpedo runs, preparing for the battle they all knew was coming. The American submarines Threadfin and Hackleback spotted the task force as it transited the Bungo Strait that evening. They reported the sighting but did not attack. There was no need. American codebreakers had already intercepted and decoded Japanese messages detailing the mission. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commander of the 5th Fleet, knew Yamato was coming. He knew her route, her destination, and her purpose. The trap was already set. At dawn on April 7, reconnaissance aircraft from Task Force 58 located the Japanese ships steaming southwest at 22 knots. Throughout the morning, American flying boats shadowed the task force, relaying position reports. Yamato's crew watched the distant specks on the horizon, knowing that each sighting brought them closer to the end. At 1000 hours, Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher ordered the strike. From the carriers of Task Force 58, over 380 aircraft rose into the sky. Helldivers, Avengers, Corsairs, and Hellcats formed up in massive waves. The pilots had been briefed. Their target was not merely another Japanese warship. It was Yamato, the symbol of Japan's naval might. Sink her, and the psychological blow would echo across the empire. At around noon, radar operators aboard Yamato detected the first wave approaching. The alarm sounded. The crew raced to battle stations. Gun crews loaded shells, damage control teams stood ready, and on the bridge, Admiral Ito and Captain Aruga watched the horizon. There was nowhere to run, no air cover to summon. Yamato's only hope lay in her armor, her anti-aircraft guns, and the skill of her crew. It would not be enough. The first wave arrived shortly after 12:30. Dive bombers plunged from the clouds, releasing their ordnance at the last possible moment. Bombs exploded across Yamato's deck and superstructure. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky with black bursts, and several American planes tumbled into the sea, but the attackers pressed through. Torpedo bombers came in low from multiple directions, coordinating their runs to prevent effective evasive maneuvering. Yamato turned hard to starboard, trying to comb the torpedo tracks, but she was too large, too slow. The first torpedo struck her port side amidships, the explosion tearing through compartments and flooding fire rooms. A second hit followed, then a third. Each impact sent shudders through the massive hull. Below decks, damage control parties fought to contain the flooding, but the scale of the damage overwhelmed their efforts. Yamato's list to port began to increase. The second wave of aircraft arrived before the first had departed. More bombs fell, more torpedoes drove into her flanks. Yamato's anti-aircraft fire remained heavy, but it was wildly inaccurate. The 25mm guns lacked the range and hitting power to stop determined attackers. Bombs penetrated the deck armor in places, detonating deep within the ship. Fire spread through passageways. The steering was damaged, limiting maneuverability. Still, Yamato fought on. Her massive guns tried to fire the special anti-aircraft shells designed to explode in the paths of attacking planes, but the shells proved ineffective. The aircraft were too small, too fast, too numerous. The third wave struck at 13:45. By now, Yamato was listing heavily to port, her speed reduced to 18 knots. Her main battery could no longer train properly. The list meant the guns could not depress to their firing angles. She was defensively crippled, unable to shoot back, unable to maneuver effectively, and still the bombs and torpedoes came. Captain Aruga made a desperate decision. To correct the list, he ordered the starboard engine rooms flooded. This would add weight to the starboard side and hopefully restore some balance. It also meant condemning 300 men in those compartments to death by drowning. There was no time to evacuate them, no way to save them. They understood. The valves were opened. Seawater rushed in. The list decreased slightly, but it was far too late. The flooding was uncontrollable. Yamato's bow began to dip. More torpedoes struck the port side, each one accelerating the inevitable. At 14:23, the list reached 35 degrees. Then it increased to 80. Yamato was rolling over. Men on deck clung to railings, to gun mounts, to anything that might hold them. Those trapped below faced a darkness filled with rushing water. Admiral Ito and Captain Aruga went down with the ship, making no attempt to abandon her. As Yamato capsized completely, her forward magazines, loaded with thousands of pounds of high-explosive shells, broke free from their restraints and tumbled against the overhead bulkheads. The impact triggered the fuses. At 14:23, Yamato exploded. The detonation was unlike anything the American pilots had ever witnessed. The forward magazine, holding hundreds of tons of high-explosive shells for the 18-inch guns, erupted in a fireball that split the sky. A mushroom-shaped cloud rose nearly 20,000 feet into the air, visible from Kagoshima over 100 miles away. The shockwave rippled across the water, and aircraft flying overhead were buffeted by the blast. Some American pilots reported seeing several planes tumble from the sky, knocked down by the force of the explosion. The sea boiled. Metal fragments, some weighing tons, rained down across a radius of miles. Where Yamato had been, there was now only smoke and churning water. The largest battleship ever built had ceased to exist in an instant. Of the 3,332 men aboard, only 276 survived. Vice Admiral Ito never left the flag cabin. Captain Aruga had tied himself to the binnacle on the bridge, refusing evacuation. Executive Officer Nomura and thousands of others were trapped below decks as the ship capsized, dragged down into the darkness by the suction of the sinking hull. Those who managed to reach the water faced their own nightmare. The sea was covered in burning oil. Men swam through flames, their lungs seared by smoke and heat. The 4 surviving destroyers raced through the debris field, pulling survivors from the water whenever possible. Many sailors were too badly burned or injured to be saved. Others simply vanished beneath the waves, exhausted and unable to continue. The light cruiser Yahaji had been sunk minutes before Yamato, struck by 12 bombs and 7 torpedoes. She took 545 of her 1,000-man crew to the bottom. The destroyers Asashimo, Hamakase, and Kasumi were also lost. In total, the Surface Special Attack Force sacrificed over 4,000 lives. The mission to reach Okinawa had failed before the ships came within 200 miles of the island. In exchange, the Americans lost 10 aircraft and 12 crewmen. It was not a battle. It was an execution. The disparity was so stark that it left no room for debate. The era of the battleship, already fading, had ended completely. No amount of armor, no size of gun, could protect a surface vessel from concentrated air attack. Yamato had been designed to face enemy battleships in a climactic surface duel that would decide the war. That duel never came. Instead, she was destroyed by weapons she could not effectively counter, in a mission that had no hope of success from the beginning. For the Japanese sailors who survived, the trauma was profound and lasting. When the 4 destroyers limped back to Japan, their decks crowded with injured and burned men, the Imperial Navy held the survivors as virtual prisoners. They were confined to Kure Naval Base for a month, isolated from their families and the outside world. Parents who had heard rumors of the sinking believed their sons were dead. The Navy feared that news of Yamato's destruction would shatter morale and reveal the true extent of Japan's collapse. When the survivors were finally released, many struggled to speak of what they had witnessed. Kazuhiro Fukumoto, one of the few who lived, later described the silence imposed upon them. They carried the memory of the explosion, the screams, the burning sea, but they were not permitted to share it. The destruction of Yamato haunted them for the rest of their lives. In 2006, more than 60 years after the sinking, 280 surviving family members and veterans sailed on a commemorative voyage, following the exact route of Operation Ten-Go and holding ceremonies over the site where their loved ones and comrades had perished. Yet the significance of Yamato's sinking extended far beyond the personal grief of those who lost friends and family. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, the loss was catastrophic not merely in material terms but in symbolic weight. Yamato had been the physical embodiment of Japan's determination to compete with and surpass the industrial might of the West. Her name, drawn from the ancient Yamato province, was synonymous with Japan itself. To lose her was to lose something fundamental about national identity. The Navy had believed, and had encouraged the public to believe, that as long as Yamato remained afloat, Japan could not be defeated. That belief died with the ship. The wreckage of Yamato lies today in the East China Sea, 180 miles southwest of Kagoshima, 1,120 feet below the surface. The hull is broken into 2 main sections, a bow to midship segment roughly 560 feet long and a stern section of 264 feet. The explosion that destroyed her scattered debris across the seafloor. Her massive turrets, each weighing thousands of tons, lie separated from the hull. The 6-foot-wide chrysanthemum crest, the symbol of the imperial family, still adorns her bow, a silent marker of what she once represented. The wreck was first located in 1985. Subsequent surveys, including a detailed digital mapping in 2016, confirmed her identity and revealed the extent of the damage. The images and artifacts recovered from the site are now displayed at the Yamato Museum in Kure, which opened in 2005 near the shipyard where she was built. The museum's centerpiece is a massive 1:10 scale model of the battleship, 26.3 meters long, meticulously detailed to honor the craftsmanship that went into her construction. Visitors walk around the model in silence, confronted by both the majesty of the engineering and the tragedy of its ultimate futility. The museum's exhibits explore not only the technical specifications of the ship but also the human stories of those who built her, served aboard her, and died with her. The museum does not glorify Yamato's role in the war. Instead, it presents her as a symbol of both technological achievement and the devastating cost of militarism. In the decades following the war, Yamato became deeply embedded in Japanese culture, though the nature of that presence evolved over time. Immediately after the defeat, there was silence. Japan was occupied, humiliated, and struggling to rebuild from ashes. The memory of the battleship was painful, a reminder of hubris and catastrophic loss. But as the years passed and Japan began to redefine its identity, Yamato re-emerged in the national consciousness. She became a figure of both mourning and reflection, a vessel through which the Japanese people could explore themes of sacrifice, honor, and the consequences of war. In 1974, the anime series Space Battleship Yamato premiered, created by Leiji Matsumoto. The series reimagined the sunken battleship as a starship, raised from the ocean floor and rebuilt to save humanity from an alien threat. The show was a massive success, spawning multiple films and sequels that continued into the 21st century. The series resonated deeply because it allowed a generation of Japanese viewers to reclaim the name Yamato and associate it with heroism and redemption rather than defeat. The space battleship fought only in self-defense, embodying a pacifist ideal even as it carried the legacy of a warship. For many, it was a way to reconcile pride in their technological past with a commitment to peace in the present. The transformation of Yamato into a cultural icon was not without controversy. Critics argued that the glorification of the battleship, even in fictional form, risked sanitizing the militarism that had led Japan into disaster. Others saw the space opera as a legitimate form of national healing, a way to process trauma and loss without denying the reality of what had occurred. Films and literature continued to explore the battleship's story. In 2005, the 60th anniversary of the war's end, a live-action film titled Yamato was released, based on the book by Jun Henmei. The film focused on the human dimension of the final mission, portraying the sailors as young men caught in a system that demanded their deaths. It became a commercial success, earning over 5 billion yen at the Japanese box office. Audiences wept openly in theaters, confronted by the waste of life and the futility of the mission. The film did not shy away from the tragedy. It presented Operation 10-Go as a suicide mission born of desperation and pride, not strategy. The recurring theme in these cultural works is the dual nature of Yamato's legacy. She represents the pinnacle of pre-war Japanese engineering, proof that Japan could compete with any industrial power in the world. Yet she also represents the catastrophic failure of that same ambition, the hubris that led a nation into a war it could not win. The battleship's name, synonymous with Japan itself, serves as a metaphor for the empire's rise and fall. To remember Yamato is to remember both achievement and tragedy, pride and sorrow. This duality has made her a potent symbol in post-war Japan, a touchstone for discussions about militarism, nationalism, and the path toward reconciliation. Educational programs use the story of Yamato to teach younger generations about the realities of war. The emphasis is not on glorifying combat but on understanding the human cost and the importance of preventing future conflicts. The battleship serves as a reminder that technological superiority alone cannot guarantee victory and that wars fought for national pride often lead only to ruin. In contemporary Japan, the memory of Yamato exists within a broader conversation about the nation's wartime past. Some see her as a symbol of misguided militarism, a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition. Others view her as a representation of the courage and sacrifice of ordinary sailors, who served their country under impossible circumstances. These perspectives are not mutually exclusive. The complexity of Yamato's legacy reflects the complexity of Japan's own historical reckoning. The battleship's story also resonates internationally. Naval historians and enthusiasts around the world study the Yamato-class as the ultimate expression of battleship design, a vessel that pushed the boundaries of what was technically possible. Yet they also recognize that she arrived too late. By the time Yamato was commissioned, the dominance of the battleship was already over. The Battle of Taranto in 1940, the sinking of the HMS Prince of Wales and Repulse in 1941, and the attack on Pearl Harbor all demonstrated that aircraft carriers, not battleships, were the decisive weapons of modern naval warfare. Japan's decision to build Yamato represented a fundamental misunderstanding of how the war would be fought. The irony is overwhelming. Japan possessed some of the most advanced carrier aviation in the world at the start of the war. The attack on Pearl Harbor was executed with precision and devastating effectiveness by carrier-borne aircraft. Yet the Imperial Navy continued to believe that the final decisive battle would be won by battleships slugging it out in a gun duel at close range. This belief was rooted in decades of doctrine and tradition, a vision of naval warfare that dated back to the age of Trafalgar and Jutland. Yamato was the embodiment of that outdated vision, a floating anachronism even before she was launched. Her 18-inch guns were designed to destroy enemy battleships that would never come within range. Her armor was designed to withstand shells from enemy battleships that would never fire at her. The war she was built to fight did not happen. Instead, she faced an enemy that attacked from the sky, and against that enemy, all her armor and firepower were useless. The final mission of Yamato, Operation 10-Go, encapsulates this tragic disconnect. The mission was conceived not out of any realistic hope for success but out of a desperate need to preserve honor. The Emperor had asked what the Navy was doing to defend Okinawa, and the Navy could not admit that it had become irrelevant. So they sent Yamato and her escorts on a one-way voyage, knowing full well that the ships would be destroyed before reaching their objective. The sailors who embarked on that mission understood they were being sacrificed for the sake of appearances. They went anyway, bound by duty and the cultural imperative to serve even unto death. This willingness to embrace suicide missions in the final months of the war is one of the most disturbing aspects of Imperial Japan's military culture. The kamikaze pilots, the banzai charges, the orders to fight to the last man, all reflected a philosophy that valued death over defeat, honor over survival. Operation 10-Go fit seamlessly into that pattern. It was a gesture, a symbol, an act of defiance that would change nothing but would allow the Navy to claim it had fought until the end. For the men aboard Yamato, the mission must have felt surreal. They knew the ship was doomed. They had seen what American carrier aircraft could do. They had witnessed the destruction of Musashi at Leyte Gulf, pummeled by wave after wave of dive bombers and torpedo planes until she rolled over and sank. They knew that Yamato would face the same fate. Yet they maintained discipline, manned their stations, and fought until the ship broke apart beneath them. That discipline, that adherence to duty in the face of certain death, is what Japanese culture has chosen to remember and honor. The sailors are not celebrated for achieving a military objective, because they achieved none. They are remembered for their courage, their loyalty, and their willingness to sacrifice themselves for a cause that was already lost. Whether this sacrifice was noble or tragic, heroic or wasteful, depends on one's perspective. What is undeniable is that it was real, and that it cost thousands of lives. The strategic impact of Yamato's sinking was minimal. By April 1945, Japan had already lost the war. The American advance was unstoppable. The invasion of Okinawa would succeed regardless of whether Yamato reached the island. The destruction of the battleship did not alter the course of the campaign. What it did accomplish was to reinforce, with brutal clarity, the obsolescence of the battleship as a weapon of war. After Yamato went down, no navy in the world would prioritize battleship construction. The future belonged to aircraft carriers, submarines, and eventually to guided missiles. The age of the big gunship was over. In this sense, Yamato's legacy is not one of triumph but of transition. She marks the end of an era. Her sinking was not a turning point in the war, but it was a symbolic moment that underscored the transformation of naval warfare. The massive guns, the thick armor, the imposing size, all the attributes that made battleships seem invincible, were rendered irrelevant by the advent of air power. Yamato was the last and greatest expression of a doctrine that no longer worked. If you're captivated by these untold stories of innovation, miscalculation, and the human cost of war, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. There's so much more to explore from the battlefields and backrooms of World War II. For modern audiences, the story of Yamato offers lessons that extend beyond naval history. It is a case study in the dangers of clinging to outdated doctrines in the face of changing realities. The Japanese Navy invested enormous resources into building the Yamato-class battleships, diverting steel, labor, and expertise that might have been used to build more carriers or improve air defenses. The decision was driven by tradition, by pride, and by a refusal to accept that the nature of warfare had fundamentally changed. This kind of strategic rigidity is not unique to Japan or to World War II. Throughout history, militaries and governments have struggled to adapt to new technologies and new methods of warfare. The lessons of Yamato, the importance of flexibility, the need to recognize when cherished assumptions no longer hold true, remain relevant today. Her story is a reminder that power, no matter how overwhelming it may seem, can become obsolete if it is not aligned with the realities of the battlefield. The human dimension of Yamato's story also continues to resonate. The sailors who served aboard her were not abstractions or statistics. They were young men with families, with dreams, with lives that were cut short by a war they did not start. Their letters, their diaries, the testimonies of the few who survived, all paint a picture of ordinary people caught in extraordinary and terrible circumstances. They did their duty, they showed courage, and they died for a cause that history has judged harshly. Their sacrifice deserves to be remembered, not as propaganda or myth, but as a sober acknowledgement of the cost of war. The families who lost sons, brothers, and fathers aboard Yamato carried that grief for the rest of their lives. The commemorative voyage in 2006, more than 60 years after the sinking, speaks to the enduring pain of that loss. The act of returning to the site, of holding ceremonies over the water where Yamato went down, was a way for survivors and families to find closure, to honor the dead, and to ensure that their stories would not be forgotten. Today, the memory of Yamato serves multiple purposes in Japanese society. For some, she is a symbol of misguided militarism, a warning about the dangers of nationalist fervor and the pursuit of technological superiority without strategic wisdom. For others, she represents the resilience and ingenuity of the Japanese people, a testament to what they could achieve even under immense pressure. For historians, she is a fascinating study in naval architecture, strategic planning, and the evolution of warfare. And for the families of those who died aboard her, she is a memorial, a place of mourning, and a connection to loved ones lost long ago. The wreck of Yamato, lying deep beneath the waves, is both a tomb and a monument. It is a physical reminder that the battleship era has passed, that the weapons and doctrines of one age cannot sustain themselves into the next. The rust and decay that now cover her hull are the inevitable result of time, but they also symbolize the decay of the imperial ambitions that drove her creation. The ocean has claimed Yamato, as it has claimed so many ships before and since, and the silence of the deep is a fitting end for a vessel that was, in the end, a floating coffin for thousands of men who deserved better. The title of this story, Japan Shocked When Its Super Battleships Became Floating Coffins, captures the essence of Yamato's tragedy. The shock was not merely that the battleships were sunk. It was the realization that everything they represented, the doctrine, the strategy, the vision of decisive naval combat, was fundamentally flawed. The super battleships were supposed to be Japan's ace, the weapon that would turn the tide and secure victory. Instead, they became symbols of failure, expensive relics that consumed resources and offered nothing in return. The men aboard them paid the price for that miscalculation, and their deaths stand as a grim testament to the consequences of strategic blindness. Yamato's story is one of irony, ambition, and loss. She was the most powerful battleship ever built, yet she accomplished almost nothing. She was designed to dominate the seas, yet she spent most of her career in port. She was meant to be unsinkable, yet she was destroyed in less than 2 hours. And she carried the name of Japan itself, only to become a symbol of the empire's defeat. In the end, Yamato was not a weapon of war. She was a monument to hubris, a floating fortress that arrived too late and fought the wrong war. Her legacy endures not because of what she achieved, but because of what she represents, the pinnacle of an era that was already ending, the ultimate expression of a doctrine that no longer worked, and the final resting place of thousands of men who believed in her invincibility until the very end.